On today's edition of Locked on LSU, we will talk to Stefan Krajisnik, who covers Mississippi State for the Clarion Ledger in Mississippi. What does he think about this Mississippi State team, its strengths, its weaknesses, and what are they thinking about this matchup down there in Starkville? We'll get into that and so much more on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Fenton, and I'm your host, as I am every day. I've been covering LSU football since 2016, and I now host a sports talk radio show in Nashville, Tennessee. You can find us on your preferred podcast platform or check us out on YouTube as well. Just search Locked on LSU in the search bar and hit that subscribe button, and you won't miss a second of your Locked on LSU content. And joining Locked on LSU today, and of course, another crossover Thursday, we've got Stefan Krajisnik, who covers Mississippi State for the Clarion Ledger in Mississippi. First and foremost, the overall question that I want to ask you leading into this Mississippi State LSU matchup is how much your Mississippi State fans are looking at that game in 2020, where Mississippi State looked like the most unstoppable team in the country, and LSU went from, the high of winning the national championship all the way to the lows of getting embarrassed starting their season off in 2020 with a loss against Mississippi State.
Yeah, Caroline, I think it's a good point because so much has changed since then, right? Like, I mean, the coaching staff for LSU, defensive coordinator changed twice since then. Obviously, Coach O is because it's so different. But I think, and the mental side of it, Mississippi State has so many experienced players that played in that game that I think Mississippi State fans kind of look at, okay, a night game in Baton Rouge, maybe not as scary of a thought as it would have been before, because a lot of these players have gone into Tiger Stadium and walked out with a win a couple of years ago. Like, these are players who have played in that environment, though it was limited. Obviously, COVID, rules were still in place, and this will be a raucous environment this weekend. That probably is a million times better than that was. But there's that aspect of, hey, we walked into the stadium before, walked out with a win, that I think Mississippi State fans and Mississippi State players carry this week that maybe they didn't have a couple of years ago when that matchup came around.
And that's totally understandable. It's a difficult environment to win in, but not even just carrying the momentum from a couple of years ago, but also carrying the momentum of the success that Mississippi State has had so far this season. Entering Tiger Stadium 2-0, a big win against Memphis, a huge win on the road against Arizona, limiting Arizona a ton on offense. So what's kind of the vibe, the feeling surrounding this team so far where it stands?
Yeah, the expectations for this team, especially in Starkville, are high. It's a team that at almost every position returns a starter or someone who has some level of experience, which we don't see a lot of in this transfer portal era. We see so many players leaving or going somewhere where they can have a bigger role. That hasn't been the case at Mississippi State. They've kept a lot of players and really, developed players under Mike Leach and his coaching staff to understand offensively and defensively what this program is trying to do. And it all starts with Will Rogers. He's a guy who is one of the more experienced quarterbacks in the SEC, understands the air raid offense almost as good as any quarterback to play in the air raid has ever done. It has really built and so far it's worked. They've executed things almost flawlessly in two wins where, you've looked at the two wins that they have, the average margin of victory is 24, and you're still saying, well, I don't think they've reached, the peak of what they can do this year, which is also a scary thought. Like, when this team does put it together, what can they do? And this weekend is kind of when that starts being put to the test. They're not ranked. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, their game one was a night game that also had a 2-hour weather delay in it. So the game didn't finish until like midnight. Okay. And then now they go to Arizona, another late game where it doesn't finish until like 2 a.m. Local time here, that there's a lot of people that haven't watched this team play just because of when they've been playing. And now they're not ranked, but in the ESPN College Football Power Index, they're the number 8 or number 9 team that's projected to win 8 or 9 games this year. So there's some high expectations. The analytics and the projections are all high on Mississippi State. Some people believe those, some people don't. But overall, I could say that this is a team that I mean, how many times has a Mississippi State team walked into Tiger Stadium as a 2.5, 3-point favorite? It doesn't happen very often. That kind of goes to show the expectations that folks have for this program right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned, the Memphis game, the Arizona game. And it'll be that Arizona game all day long. I was like, oh yeah, Pac-12 after dark, Mississippi State. Mike Leach makes his return back to the Pac-12, and then I'm asleep on the couch by the end of the first quarter. So I hyped up that a lot. But I think that's the dangerous thing about Mississippi State. I think so far this season they've flown under the radar, and it's not like they've played cupcakes so far this year. Memphis is a solid program. Arizona's a solid program. Of course, not to the caliber of some of the teams that they're going to face in the SEC, but still, those are not easy gimme wins. And Mississippi State teams handedly. So I think that's kind of the dangerous or kind of scary thing about Mississippi State so far is two pretty solid teams and beating them by a good margin.
Yeah, I think part of it, we see it so much. I mean, there's so many upsets in college football. I mean, last week you got Appalachian State going into Texas A&M. You got Marshall going into Notre Dame. I mean, just crazy upsets. There is something to be said about even lesser opponents taking care of them and beating them by 3+ touchdowns, right? It's what you're supposed to do, but there's a lot of times we see teams not do it. And Mississippi State's done it, and it's hard to punish a team for doing that. And like you said, I mean, Arizona was a team in week 1 against San Diego State that looked pretty good. Memphis, historically, or at least in the past decade or so, has been a pretty good program. Mississippi State's looked impressive. It hasn't been the toughest schedule, but there's a lot of teams that can say, hey, through 2 games, you haven't had the toughest schedule, but you're walking out of it 1-1. There's something to be said about still winning those games.
And I don't think that there's any team really in college football, but especially not in the SEC these past 2 weeks, there's going to be a gimme or a cupcake thrown in there somewhere. You look at some teams that are starting off week 1, Florida playing Utah, Georgia playing Oregon, LSU playing Florida State, and then those schools turn around. Florida obviously playing Kentucky. They haven't had a gimme in there, but Georgia playing Samford, LSU playing Southern, those teams that have played more difficult opponents turn around and play those easier games where Mississippi State didn't have an obvious gimme in there. BetOnline.net is your #1 source for all of your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. You can find all the latest football league developments. They've got game matchups, news, and podcasts, and they've got this year's opening week's games. So BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information. They've got live betting, esports, and scores. You name it, they've got it at BetOnline. And we've got some really fun college games, plus the NFL that you can bet on. So do it with BetOnline. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite sports and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. But kind of turning around to the X's and O's side of things, just in your opinion, overall, what's the strongest part of this Mississippi State team?
Yeah, I think the strongest part, and it's ironic because of how much people talk about the air raid offense. I think the strongest part is their linebacking core of Tyrus Wheat, Jet Johnson, and Nathaniel Watson. Those are 3 guys that have been playing together for quite some time now. They really understand this 3-3-5 that Zach Arnett runs at Mississippi State and kind of what their role is. Tyrus Wheat's a guy that much playing time early and has really built a role. They understand this defense. They know the play calls as well as anyone. They watch film. They prepare as well as any linebacking core in the SEC. They're so versatile the way that they can use them and put them in different parts of the field. And we'll see how they use those 3 linebackers as it comes to preparing to face Jayden Daniels. It's going to be interesting, and it's an important aspect of the game to be good at all the time, but especially against a running quarterback like that. I think Mississippi State's pretty thankful right now that they have that linebacking core.
I mean, Nathaniel Watson is very much so that dude. And I don't think he's a household name, but I think that if Mississippi State continues the success and he just continues whatever he's been doing on the field, I think that he'll quickly turn into that. I mean, the team as a whole held Arizona. Why did I just blank on the state name? Arizona 240 rushing yards alone. I mean, this team has proved it can stop the run. And we've seen from LSU, at least in week 1 against Florida State, that's where they found so much offensive success. So really what makes this linebacking core, Nathaniel Watson, what makes them tick and what makes them so good at stopping the run?
Yeah, it does start up front with your defensive line. They got a guy like Cameron Young who's right in the middle. Jaden Crummy has been injured the first couple games. I don't know if he's going to be back for this LSU game, but Cameron Young, that really only diminishes their depth because they have a really solid front 3 there on the defensive line to really stuff things up the middle to start. And then after that, like you said, I mean, they've seen so many reps. They've played so much together, those linebackers, that they know and can read what gap a running back's going to try to go through. So, once that initial defensive line creates that pressure, well, to really slow you down. It was a really good, I think it was the nation's number 12 rush defense last year. And you basically return everyone from that front six back, that there's no reason to believe those numbers would dip. And so far they haven't. The defensive line and the linebackers have done such a good job defending the run for a better part of a year and a half now, that it's really hard for teams to establish that. And if you don't establish your run, you can't. And I think we saw this with Arizona. I mean, Arizona at some point just gave up on the running game, which understandable from the sense of they didn't have success with it. But when you give up on it, then your passing game is so predictable, right? There's right. So little you can do. And I think we saw it against Arizona. And it'll be really interesting to see what it looks like against LSU. But this is the first time that they've, this season really faced a true quarterback that can get out of the pocket and run. Seth Hennigan from Memphis does it a bit, but neither of those quarterbacks do it as well as Jayden Daniels does. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that aspect of the game, changes the result.
And I feel like my biggest takeaway just from, the brief amount of time that we've been talking, my biggest takeaway from the strengths of this team is just the sheer number of starters that they have returning. Yeah. And the fact that they have so much continuity from 2020 and 2021. It just seems like this team's greatest attribute. I mean, they have a lot of talent and they have a great offensive and defensive scheme, both in the air raid and the 3-3-5 defense, but they just have the same players and they have the continuity, which LSU does not. That's been the whole narrative of LSU, is trying to make all of these little bits and pieces form together into one cohesive unit.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a key at Mississippi State to have that. Like, Mississippi State is a type of program where, if they can go 6-6, 7-5 for, 2 to 3 years, and then every fourth year have that 9-10 win team, so much better than the talent that Mississippi State has. But you can't, like you said, you can't place a value on the experience. And when you have that, that's where you come with, that's where those 3 stars develop into being really good players. And every coach is thinking to themselves, why didn't we get this guy? I mean, Tyrus Sweet's a guy from Louisiana that Brian Kelly just spent all of his Monday press conference just gushing over him because, LSU has to be kicking itself at some extent. You had a guy right there in your backyard who's developing into one of the best linebackers in the SEC. That's what Mississippi State has to do. And that's what they've done so far, that when you get to this point of year 3 or year 4 under Leach, and you've got these experienced guys, now you can take advantage and get to that 8, 9, 10 win range, as opposed to, 7-6 last year, 4-7 the year before.
And so kind of looking at some of the biggest strengths of the team on the other side, what do you think is this team's biggest weakness that you've seen so far?
Yeah, one thing that's kind of been interesting, and I didn't really expect this to be a weakness. They're really deep at wide receiver. They have a lot of receivers who can come in there. They play 4 wide receivers. They have 2 at each spot. So not many teams have 8, 9 receivers that they feel comfortable trotting out there.
Yeah.
Mike Leach questioned their toughness a little bit throughout the August preseason camp of saying that, sometimes they were getting pushed around a bit by that secondary. They look good in the first couple of games, but there's been times where, a pass goes off a receiver's hands and bounces up and ends up being an interception. That's not Will Rogers' fault. We saw in that Arizona game, it was almost a big swing when Jameer Calvin caught a pass and had it stripped away for, a pretty easy fumble. I'm interested to see if, some of his concerns about that toughness are going to carry over into SEC play. Some of it might be that, they overlooked the ability of a Memphis or an Arizona to strip the ball away or get an interception. Well, LSU can do that, and maybe they, wake up a bit. So I'm interested to see, what the receiving core in terms of toughness looks like, in this environment.
I mean, how does that work, honestly, in such a pass-heavy offense, in an air raid offense where you rely so heavily on your receivers? How can that be what you think might be one of the weakest points of this team?
Yeah, it's a testament to how good every other aspect of this team can be, right?
Yeah,
like if you're nitpicking the toughness of the wide receivers, that shows that, they have some depth at other places. It's just one of the things that Leach talks so much about that maybe I watch it a bit, closer than I normally would. Like maybe I wouldn't nitpick as much if Leach hadn't called them out a bit for it. It's almost, it's weird because it can be a good thing in the sense of if someone isn't tough or if someone makes a crucial mistake like that, you're deep enough at the position to immediately make a substitution. And you can say, hey, like, if you're not going to show up, we're going to put you on the bench to the point where, yeah, do your job. And if you're caught not doing it, they at least have a replacement. There's so many times where we see at programs like, a wide receiver might be lazy or something like that. And there's nothing you can do because yeah, he's irritating you, but he's your only, valuable guy out there, and your quarterback needs him out there. So it's going to be interesting to see. They have some key position battles at some of those receivers positions. When it gets down to it, they can only really have two guys at each receiver spot that play any given day. And if you have three guys that are competing for it, one of those guys is going to have to sit the bench, that game. So we'll see this weekend, and we've seen it first couple of weeks, which one of those guys is going to really make it through the mold and get there and be the one that's getting playing time and prove that he's got that toughness, and which guy maybe shies away. And right now it seems like Caleb Ducking is that guy. Last year it was Mekhi Polk. He had like 106 receptions, 105 receptions, broke the Mississippi State single season record. This year, Caleb Ducking has been the one to step into that role. When you look at him, he's got the frame, right? He has all the intangibles that you look for, and the tangibles that you look for in a wide receiver. Now it's just a matter of putting it together. He's got 3 touchdowns through 2 games. It seems like he's putting it together. He's a guy that, if everything else collapses, and it's really hard when you have 4 receivers and running backs who are involved in a passing game for everything to truly collapse. But if things do fall apart, Will Rogers feels comfortable just lobbing it up and knowing that he can go up and make a catch. And we'll see a bit of that in the red zone. Like if it comes to a situation where they just want to run a fade route with him, just toss the ball up, know that he's going to be the better guy and go above the defender and catch it. That's the guy that they're going to turn to. So keep an eye on number 4 on the offense for sure.
The Mississippi State passing game, which for good reason. I mean, Will Rogers leads the SEC in passing yards. It's a fun passing offense to watch. But we don't talk a lot about the Mississippi State run game. They put up a decent amount of yards on the ground as well. So what kind of threat, in addition to this passing game, if LSU puts pressure on the quarterback, whoever the opponent may be, if you put some pressure on the quarterback, if the DBs start to cover up the wide receivers, what kind of threat does the run game pose? And how willing is this Mississippi State offense to defer to the run if the passing game just isn't working?
Yeah, more willing this year than we've seen in Leach's first 2 seasons at Mississippi State, especially in the first half. He's almost passed it as much as he's run it in the first half of games. A lot of that is play calls. A lot of that is, Will Rogers and his center, like Quincy Sharp at the line, kind of reading a defense and saying, all right, they're going to drop 8. We're going to run it here. So look for Mississippi State early in this game, again, to run it a decent amount and almost establish their running game to open up the pass game. We don't really see that because with how spread out this offense is, the pass game is almost open all the time. And that's why they pass it so much. But they've done a good job of early in games reading what defenses are bringing and then using that run game to open things up a bit more in the passing game. I'm really interested. I think the part of the game that I'm most interested to see is going to be right away what defense Brian Kelly wants to throw at Mike Leach. This is their first time going head-to-head as head coaches. 2020, the game that we talked about where State broke the passing record, 2020, Ed Orgeron, maybe one of the most foolish defensive strategies against an air raid offense before, of just doing that full-on man coverage. It was just open. The passing game was just open the entire time. He changed it a lot, and I think he did a good job in year 2. But LSU was able to build that early lead, and then Mississippi State had some special teams issues and really never got back into the game. It was a close game, but it felt like Mississippi State was making too many mistakes at that point to pull away from a team as talented as LSU. So right away, this game is going to be close, I think, throughout. And there's going to be some huge plays that are made in the fourth quarter. But what Brian Kelly throws at Mike Leach in the first quarter could dictate a lot of what we see the rest of the evening.
Don't even remind me of the 2020 defense. I mean, just criminal what Bo Pelini did to that program. But kind of looking at an overarching look at this game, I know what this game would represent. A win against Mississippi State would represent for LSU. Starting off SEC play 1-0, kind of turning the script a little bit. Florida State's in the rear view. Brian Kelly, big statement win in his first SEC game. But for Mississippi State, what does a win against LSU represent?
Yeah, I think first of all, like you said, I mean, this is a huge game for Brian Kelly. I think he can win back a lot of fans that maybe, were a little bit skeptical after that game against Florida State, and rightfully so. But for Mississippi State, not only is it a big game in terms of anytime you can go a night game at LSU and come out with a win, that's going to be huge, right? Like it doesn't matter how much LSU is struggling, how good they are. If you do that in that environment on ESPN, you're really going to get a lot of national attention, and suddenly you're making your way into those AP polls and the coaches polls and really getting some national attention. So from that aspect, that's huge right away. This game is huge for them in terms of being able to go from a 6 or 7 win team to an 8 or 9 win team. you got to take advantage against a team like LSU that maybe is going under a bit of a rebuild with Brian Kelly. You can't let that slip up, because it doesn't get any easier the rest of the way.
Some years you get the luck of the draw, and in the East you play Vanderbilt, and sometimes you don't get so lucky and you play Georgia in a critical year. And what I think, in my opinion, is a critical year for Mike Leach. I mean, looking at a 3-7 in the regular season in 2020 with a bowl win, 7-5 in the regular season with the Liberty Bowl loss in 2021. Is Mike Leach on the hot seat, or is the seat heating up?
He just got a 2-year extension in July, and the way Mississippi works in the state, they can only have a 4-year contract at a time. So like him getting a contract extension isn't maybe as big as someone else getting a contract extension. You're kind of just hit 2 of his 4 years were done, so they just gave him 2 more years. Now he's kind of back at that 4-year spot. Something that you lose those rivalry games, and it rubs people the wrong way. And it doesn't matter how good Ole Miss has been the past couple of years. That's a game Mississippi State and its fans expect to win. So if Mississippi State wins 8-9 games this year, I don't think there's a hot seat for Leach. If they're going 6-6, 7-5, and you're losing the Egg Bowl, and you're 0-3 in your tenure to start the Egg Bowl, that's when I think, at least from a fan perspective, it'll start heating up. I don't think from talking to their athletic director, they believe in what Leach is trying to do, and I think they're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. With 4 years still left on his contract, right? They're not just going to go, hey, you're 0-3 in the Egg Bowl, we're going to let you go. But from a fan perspective, they'll start pushing a little bit. They'll get a little bit uneasy, because if it's not this year and you start losing some of those experienced players, then there's going to be some tension of, okay, like, can you rebuild it? Can you do it? How quick can you rebuild it? Because if you fail this year, they're not going to give you 4 years to kind of rebuild an experienced roster. Like, this has to be a roster that those freshmen and sophomore that are playing occasionally in games this year, but are getting a lot of practice reps, they better be ready to jump right in and start winning games. Otherwise, you're going to be asking for a lot more time than maybe fans are willing to give you.
Last one for you. Your expectations for this game from Mississippi State, from LSU, just kind of put it all on the table, call it on Saturday.
Yeah. Well, I think Mississippi State's going to win, because I think they're just the better team right now, and I think the more experienced team. But I think I have them only winning by like a field goal or something like that. Like, I think it's going to be a close game. Like I said, like, so much of this game is going to be dictated by what Brian Kelly throws at Mississippi State early. And I'm really interested to see on the other side of what this LSU offense, the LSU offense has been a lot better when they've played up tempo. We saw it in that Florida State game. They're a lot better when they play quicker. Changed. But on the other side of it is Mississippi State, the way they thrive is they control the time of possession. Like, they want to have it for 40 minutes. They want to have the ball in their hand for 40 minutes, because, everyone thinks the pass attack is just big play, but like, there's a lot of 5-yard passes that take a lot of clock down, and Will Rogers and that LSU defense on the field for a long time. Whereas it's not going to happen so much the other way around. You're not going to exhaust the Mississippi State defense because they're off the field for so long. And then Brian Kelly talked about how important it is to control time of possession, or at least keep it closer. Well, it's hard to do that if you're playing up tempo, right? So it's like, it's this back and forth of like, do you want to like stop Mississippi State from dominating time of possession, or do you want to play your game and play up tempo and do what's worked best for you? That's where the X's and O's, I think, are going to be really, really fun to watch between what Leach does, what Brian Kelly does.
Stefan Krajisnik, you cover Mississippi State for the Clarion Ledger, but where can the people find you?
Yeah, you go ahead and my Twitter is at SKRAJISNIK3. That's where you'll see all my work, as well as on the ClarionLedger.com. I'm really looking forward to being there, and I'm excited. Let's get it going.
Let's do it. Let's do that football. Well, safe travels to Baton Rouge. Enjoy the game, and appreciate you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Get more on the SEC by making Locked On SEC your second listen. Every day, host Chris Gordy and the local experts of Locked On take you across the SEC in 30 minutes. Make Locked On SEC your second listen.